The arrival. The Harris family had dreamed of a fresh start, a new beginning in the safe and quiet suburbs, a place where their young daughter Zora could grow up without fear. After years of saving and planning, they finally found themselves in a neighborhood that seemed perfect, Hollowbrook Street, in the cozy little town of Stonefield. With its neat rows of homes, manicured lawns, and picket fences, the place felt like a postcard of safety and serenity. The kind of place where Zara, a bright, imaginative 8-year-old, could explore and make memories in a safe environment. Or so they thought. A small moving truck rattled up to their new address, 1423 Hollowbrook Street, stopping in front of the 2-story house. Malcolm Harris, a tall, lean man in his late 30s with a warm smile and eyes that gleamed with hope, climbed out of the driver's seat, stretching his arms above his head after the long drive. His wife, Rachel, a warm and nurturing elementary school teacher with a keen eye for detail, joined him on the curb, scanning the surroundings with a soft smile. "Come on, Zora," Rachel called, opening the back door with a wave of her hand. Their daughter burst out, excitement shining in her big brown eyes as she looked around, drinking in every detail. Zara was fearless, her braids bouncing as she darted from her parents' side to examine her new home and the houses that flanked theirs. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity, and for a moment, Malcolm and Rachel exchanged glances, their expressions mirroring relief and contentment. This was the beginning they had dreamed of. As they started unpacking, a figure approached from the neighboring yard, catching Malcolm's attention. A portly man in his 60s, his handkerchief in hand, ambled over, waving. "Welcome to Hollowbrook Street," he greeted warmly, extending his hand. "I'm Roger, your landlord." Malcolm took the man's hand, shaking it firmly. "Malcolm Harris. This is my wife, Rachel, and our daughter, Zara." Roger's eyes crinkled as he looked at Zara. "A lovely family. Glad to have you folks here. This is a good neighborhood, perfect for families," he assured them. But then he paused, glancing back at the house with a more somber expression. "Just so you're aware," he began in a low tone. "The previous tenant, old Mr. Thompson, passed away in the house a few months back. Nothing unnatural, mind you. He was in his late 80s. Lived here for over 20 years, he did. Very respected, good man." Malcolm's face betrayed a flicker of discomfort, but he quickly masked it with a polite nod. Before he could respond, Zara, who had overheard, blurted out, "Was he a ghost?" Her eyes were wide with a mix of intrigue and worry. Roger let out a hearty laugh. "Oh no, sweetheart. There are no ghosts here, just memories of a kind old man." With a wave and a nod, Roger left them to settle in, disappearing around the side of the house. Malcolm looked at Rachel, who gave him a shrug and a small smile, as if to say, "We're fine. Let's keep going." The family spent the rest of the day unpacking, organizing rooms, and familiarizing themselves with their new home. As dusk fell, Zara, worn out from the excitement, went to bed early, and Malcolm and Rachel sat down in the living room to relax for a bit. Just as Malcolm was leaning back, closing his eyes in contentment, he noticed a shadow moving outside the front window. He straightened, instinctively cautious, and glanced over at the front yard, spotting a man standing in the yard next door, arms crossed. Malcolm's heart rate quickened as he watched the stranger's gaze fix on him. The man's expression was stern, almost angry, but before Malcolm could decipher it, Rachel looked over and saw the figure as well. "Is that the neighbor?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper. The man noticed their gazes, and after a long pause, approached, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He looked to be in his 50s, his face worn with deep-set eyes, his mouth pulled into a slight sneer. He stopped at the edge of their yard and nodded stiffly. "Evening," he greeted curtly. "I'm Harold Baker. Live right next door." Malcolm offered a cautious smile, walking over and extending his hand. "Malcolm Harris. Nice to meet you." But Harold didn't take the hand. His eyes scanned Malcolm, then moved to Rachel and Zara, who had come out of the house, drawn by the sound of voices. "So, you're the new folks, huh? Interesting choice of neighborhood." His words were laced with something Malcolm couldn't quite place. Disdain, maybe. He tightened his smile, trying to keep the conversation light. "Yes, we're looking forward to settling in. It seems like a wonderful area." Harold's sneer deepened. Maybe it was. "You know, people like Mr. Thompson, the kind of people who built this place, they're gone. And now," he cast a disdainful glance at the family, "well, let's just say not everyone belongs here." Rachel tensed at the implication, her voice steady but firm. "We moved here to raise our daughter in a safe environment, and that's exactly what we intend to do." Harold shrugged. "Suit yourself. But don't be surprised if things don't go as planned. Not everyone here likes changes to our community." He let out a low chuckle that held no humor, nodded once, then turned and strode away without another word. As Malcolm and Rachel stood there in silence, Malcolm felt an unexpected pang of dread settle in his chest. This wasn't the welcome he had anticipated, and it left a bitter taste. He turned to Rachel and tried to brush it off. "We didn't move here to make friends. We came here for Zara," he said with forced lightness. Rachel nodded, giving him a reassuring squeeze. That night, after tucking Zara into bed and reassuring her that their new house was safe and sound, Malcolm and Rachel finally climbed into bed. They fell into an exhausted sleep, only to be jolted awake in the early hours by a piercing scream. Malcolm leaped out of bed, his heart racing as he ran down the hall to Zara's room, where he found her sitting up in bed, her face streaked with tears. She threw herself into her father's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "Daddy, there was a man," she whispered, clutching him tightly. "He was in my room, just standing there, watching me." Malcolm scanned the room, checking every corner. The closet, even under the bed. There was nothing there, no sign of an intruder. But Zara was shaking, her voice a small, terrified whimper as she tried to describe what she had seen. "He was tall, his face was old, and he just stared at me." Rachel came in, her face pale with worry, and took Zara into her arms, stroking her hair. "It's okay, honey. It was just a bad dream. Sometimes, moving to a new place can make us imagine things that aren't really there." Zara shook her head vigorously, her voice breaking. "No, Mommy. He was real." Malcolm shared a look with Rachel, concern etched into his face. They both knew that Zara had a vivid imagination. But this was different. The raw fear in her eyes unsettled them both. Malcolm stayed by Zara's side, comforting her until she finally drifted back to sleep, her small body exhausted from crying. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Rachel whispered, "Do you think she was just dreaming?" Malcolm sighed, staring into the darkness. "I don't know, but we'll keep an eye on her. Maybe she just needs time to get used to the new place." But as he lay there, trying to convince himself that it was all just a nightmare, the memory of Harold Baker's sneer and the landlord's story about Mr. Thompson gnawed at him. The first signs. In the days following Zora's terrifying encounter, the Harris family tried to settle into their new home, but an undercurrent of unease hung over them. Despite their best efforts to reassure her, Zora continued to complain about a shadowy figure in her room each night. Malcolm and Rachel took turns staying with her until she fell asleep, hoping that their presence would be enough to soothe her. But each morning, Zora woke up claiming the man had returned. The repeated stories and Zora's pale, anxious face every morning gnawed at Malcolm. He found himself lingering in her doorway long after she'd fallen asleep, listening intently for any unusual sounds. Rationally, he told himself it was just Zora's imagination, adjusting to a new environment. But as a father, he couldn't ignore the weight in his chest each time she spoke about the man. One evening, Malcolm decided to bring it up again after Zora had gone to bed. He sat across from Rachel in the dimly lit kitchen, each of them nursing cups of coffee. The air between them was thick with unspoken worries. "Ratch, Maybe we should get some kind of alarm or even a security camera for her room. Something to reassure her, Malcolm suggested, staring into his coffee cup. Rachel looked up at him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and concern. I understand, Malcolm. But an alarm? In our daughter's room? This whole thing seems so exaggerated. Zara has always had an active imagination, especially with moving to a new place. Maybe we're giving it too much attention. But what if she's not imagining it? Malcolm's voice dropped to a near whisper. She's been so consistent. Every night, she describes the same man. An older man standing at the foot of her bed. And then there's the landlord's comment about the previous tenant, and honestly, I keep thinking about Harold Baker next door. Rachel shivered, as if an invisible hand had brushed her skin. Harold. I don't like him either. But he's just a grumpy old man, Malcolm. It feels almost paranoid to think he's somehow involved. Malcolm sighed, pushing his coffee cup away. I just want her to feel safe. I want us all to feel safe here. That's why we moved in the first place. He paused, looking around the unfamiliar kitchen. But since we arrived, something hasn't felt right. Rachel squeezed his hand, offering a small, reassuring smile. Let's give it some time. Zora might adjust. She's strong. And if things don't settle, then we'll consider other options. The next few days passed without incident. Malcolm and Rachel breathed a little easier, thinking that perhaps Zora's anxiety was fading. Zora's nightmares had reduced to mere whimpers in her sleep, and Malcolm even found himself smiling as he watched his daughter play outside, her laughter ringing out like music. But everything changed one humid night in late July. Malcolm and Rachel were fast asleep when a noise jerked Malcolm awake. At first, he lay there, his heart pounding as he tried to make sense of the sound. It was faint, like a soft scraping, and seemed to be coming from down the hall, from Zora's room. He nudged Rachel, whispering, "Did you hear that?" Rachel stirred, mumbling sleepily, "It's probably nothing, Malcolm. Go back to sleep." But the sound persisted, faint but steady. Malcolm slipped out of bed, feeling his pulse quicken as he crept toward Zora's room. When he reached her door, he held his breath, listening. The scraping noise was definitely coming from within. With a surge of adrenaline, he flung the door open and flicked on the light. The room was as it always was, save for the look of terror in Zora's eyes. She sat upright in bed, her gaze locked onto the closet door, her entire body tense with fear. "Daddy," she cried, scrambling toward him. Malcolm scooped her into his arms, his heart racing as he looked around the room. The closet door was slightly ajar, casting an eerie shadow across the floor. "What is it, sweetheart? What did you see?" he whispered, stroking her hair as he glanced warily at the closet. Zora buried her face in his shoulder, her voice muffled but frantic. "It was him, Daddy. He was in the closet, just watching me. I could hear him breathing." Malcolm felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He slowly approached the closet, every step measured and cautious. Reaching out, he swung the door wide open, but the closet was empty. There was nothing there except Zora's clothes and a few scattered toys on the floor. Turning back to Zora, he forced a comforting smile. "See, honey. There's nothing here, just clothes and toys. You're safe." But as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He could still feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Zora's fear was too real, too visceral, to be a mere product of her imagination. The following day, Malcolm was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. After dropping Zora off at a friend's house for the day, he started installing small security cameras in her room. He knew Rachel might object if she found out, but he couldn't ignore the sense of unease that had been gnawing at him since they moved in. By the time Rachel returned home that evening, the cameras were discreetly hidden and ready to go. Malcolm didn't mention his plan, not wanting to add to her stress. He told himself he would check the footage each morning and hopefully find nothing unusual. Maybe Zora really was imagining things, but if she wasn't, That night, with the cameras set up, Malcolm found it harder to fall asleep. His mind buzzed with questions and half-formed fears. Would he finally see proof of the intruder, or would Zora's fears be laid to rest? When morning came, Malcolm was up before dawn, unable to contain his curiosity. He quietly slipped out of bed and went to his laptop, pulling up the footage from Zora's room. As he scrolled through hours of nothing but Zora shifting in her sleep, he began to feel foolish, almost convinced that he was overreacting. But then, at 2:47 a.m., he saw something. The footage showed Zora lying in bed, breathing deeply. She was fast asleep. Then, from the shadows near the closet, a faint, wispy figure emerged. Malcolm's heart raced as he watched the figure move closer to Zora's bed, hovering at the foot of it, just as she had described. The figure was barely there, almost like a smudge on the screen, but its form was unmistakable. A man, tall and hunched, with a ghostly pale face. Malcolm's hands trembled as he rewound the footage, watching in horror as the figure lingered over Zora, unmoving, before finally retreating back into the shadows. He felt a surge of dread, his mind reeling as he tried to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a nightmare or an overactive imagination. Something was in their house, something that shouldn't be there. Malcolm closed the laptop, his mind racing. He knew he had to tell Rachel, but he didn't want to scare her. How could he explain what he had just witnessed? How could he make her believe him? Later that morning, over breakfast, Malcolm finally mustered the courage to tell Rachel what he had seen. She listened, her face pale and expression tense, as he described the footage. "Malcolm," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are you sure it wasn't some kind of glitch? A trick of the light?" He shook his head. "I know what I saw, Rachel. It was real. Zora's been right all along. There's someone, or something, in that room." They exchanged a long, tense look, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever was happening, they were in this together, and no matter what it took, they would protect Zora. As the day wore on, Rachel suggested they take Zora to a child psychologist, just to make sure her fears weren't stemming from something they couldn't see. Malcolm agreed, although he knew Zora's fear was very real. But beneath their discussions and assurances, they both knew they were standing on the edge of something dark and unexplainable. And neither of them could shake the feeling that whatever was haunting Zora was far from finished. The first sign had been witnessed. The shadows were real. And as they both feared, the worst was yet to come. The warnings begin. The atmosphere in the Harris home grew tense in the days following Malcolm's discovery. He couldn't unsee the eerie figure lingering over Zora in her sleep, and even though he tried to keep calm for Rachel and Zora's sake, Malcolm's nights were now riddled with restless hours, every creak or whisper of the house sharpening his anxiety. They needed answers, but how could they explain something so unexplainable? After watching the footage together, Rachel had agreed that they needed to take Zora's complaints seriously, but she still struggled to fully believe it. She clung to the possibility of some trick of light, a technical glitch, anything that would make this less frightening. But Malcolm knew in his gut that this was real. Zora's nightmares weren't just figments of her imagination. They were warnings. Determined to do everything he could to understand what was happening, Malcolm started digging into the history of the house. He spent hours in the local library, poring over property records, news clippings, and any information he could find on Hollowbrook Street and its previous owners. He uncovered very little, mostly mundane reports about zoning changes and routine sales. But a small article from 30 years ago caught his eye. The article was about a tragedy on Hollowbrook Street, a death that had happened right in their home. Malcolm's breath hitched as he read further. The man, Mr. Thompson, who had lived in the house for over 2 decades, had purchased it shortly after his wife passed away under mysterious circumstances. There were whispers that her death had left him unwell, that he'd become reclusive, rarely leaving the house. Malcolm's pulse quickened as he read the last lines of the article. Neighbors claimed that in his later years, Thompson would talk to the walls at night, mumbling incoherent phrases as if speaking to unseen visitors. When Malcolm returned home that evening, he was pale and visibly shaken. Rachel was waiting for him in the kitchen, her expression filled with worry. She gestured for him to sit, pouring him a cup of tea before she sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly together. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm nodded slowly, recounting the details he'd uncovered about Mr. Thompson and his strange behavior. He explained the article and the unsettling way Thompson had supposedly spoken to the walls. Rachel's face paled, and she took a shaky breath. "So, you're saying that the man Zara's been seeing is what? Thompson, his spirit?" Malcolm hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know, Rach, but I do know that something is happening in this house, something that has been here since long before we moved in. And whatever it is, it's making itself known to Zara." Rachel's eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We can't just sit here, Malcolm. We have to protect her. If there's something in this house, we need to find a way to make it leave." But the question of how lingered heavily between them. They knew they needed help, but the idea of reaching out for help on something so bizarre, so outside the realm of everyday experience, felt impossible. Later that night, after tucking Zara into bed and giving her an extra-long hug, Malcolm found himself pacing through the house, his mind racing. As he passed by the living room window, he noticed a figure standing outside, barely visible in the dim light. It was their neighbor, Harold Baker, his arms crossed as he looked toward the house with an expression of smug satisfaction. Malcolm felt a surge of irritation. He opened the door and stepped outside, walking up to Harold, who didn't flinch as Malcolm approached. Instead, Harold gave him a small, mocking smile. "Late night, Mr. Harris." Harold's voice was laced with contempt. Malcolm tried to keep his composure, but his voice was tense. "What are you doing out here, Harold?" "Just taking a walk," Harold replied smoothly, his eyes glinting with a hint of malice. "It's a quiet neighborhood, you know. Perfect for people who respect tradition, who don't disturb the peace with nonsense." "What are you trying to say?" Malcolm demanded, his patience wearing thin. Harold leaned in closer, his voice a harsh whisper. "I'm saying you and your family don't belong here. Hollowbrook Street doesn't welcome outsiders. People who come here, they find that out eventually." Malcolm clenched his fists, resisting the urge to lash out. "Is that a threat?" Harold straightened, his expression cold and unyielding. "It's a warning. I'd suggest you listen." Without another word, Harold turned and walked away, his figure swallowed by the shadows of the street. Malcolm stood there, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. He knew Harold's hostility ran deep, but tonight it felt like more than just prejudice. It felt like Harold knew something he wasn't saying. When Malcolm went back inside, he found Rachel waiting for him, her face lined with worry. "What did he say?" she asked, sensing his tension. "Nothing useful," Malcolm replied, but the unease from the encounter lingered. He didn't tell her about the thinly veiled threat, not wanting to scare her further. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that Harold was somehow connected to what was happening. The next morning, they decided to take Zara to the local therapist they'd found, hoping that a professional might be able to help Zara process her experiences. Dr. Morgan was a kind, middle-aged woman with a calming presence, and Zara seemed to relax in her office, surrounded by bookshelves and plush toys. After a few gentle questions, Zara began to open up about the man in her room, describing him in vivid detail. "He's tall, with a wrinkly face. He wears a suit, like a really old one. And he just stands there, watching. I can hear him breathing sometimes," she whispered, her voice wavering. Dr. Morgan took notes, her expression thoughtful. "Zara, do you think this man wants to hurt you?" Zara hesitated, biting her lip. "No, but he scares me. It feels like he's trying to say something, like he's angry." Dr. Morgan nodded, giving Zara a reassuring smile. "Thank you for telling me, Zara. You're very brave." After the session, Dr. Morgan spoke privately with Malcolm and Rachel. "I believe Zara is experiencing something very real to her. Whether it's a dream or a reaction to stress, she feels genuinely threatened. I'd recommend creating a safe space for her, something that makes her feel protected." Malcolm and Rachel nodded, though they both knew that this was more than just a reaction to stress. They thanked Dr. Morgan, trying to hold on to the hope that some of her suggestions might help. That night, they made a ritual of putting Zara to bed, placing her favorite stuffed animals around her, and hanging a dream catcher by her window, something Dr. Morgan had suggested to help Zara feel secure. But despite their efforts, Malcolm could see the fear in Zara's eyes as they tucked her in, her small body tense under the covers. Just past midnight, Malcolm sat awake, unable to sleep. The events of the past days had left him feeling constantly on edge, and every little noise in the house seemed magnified in the silence. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from Zara's room, followed by a piercing scream. Malcolm and Rachel bolted out of bed, racing down the hall to find Zara huddled in the corner of her room, her eyes wide with terror. "He was here," she cried, her voice trembling. "He was right here, standing by the bed. And he looked angry." Malcolm moved to the bed, his heart pounding as he checked every corner of the room. The window was locked, the closet empty, no sign of anyone. But on the wall above Zara's bed, scrawled in dark, jagged letters, was a single word: "Leave." Rachel gasped, covering her mouth with her hand as she stared at the word in horror. Malcolm felt his stomach drop, a cold dread spreading through him. This was no coincidence, no figment of Zara's imagination. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the reality of their situation settling over them like a dark cloud. Malcolm knelt down beside Zara, pulling her into his arms. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're going to keep you safe. I promise." But as he said the words, he knew they were empty. They were up against something they couldn't understand, something that seemed to hold a malevolent power over their home. And the one person who might have answers, Harold, had made it clear he wouldn't be helping them. The message was clear: whoever or whatever was haunting their home wanted them gone. But Malcolm wasn't about to let his family be driven away. He made a silent vow to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. As they sat together in the dim light of Zara's room, Malcolm felt a flicker of resolve deep within him. They would face this threat, and they would find a way to free their family from its grasp. They had no choice. Because now, the shadows were not just a warning. They were a promise of the darkness that lay ahead. Descent into darkness. The morning after the word "Leave" appeared on Zara's wall, the Harris family's mood was grim. Malcolm and Rachel went about their day with heavy hearts, each weighed down by an unspoken question: what was lurking in their home? And how long could they protect Zara from it? The strange occurrences escalated over the following days. Doors creaked open on their own, cold drafts swept through rooms despite the summer heat, and Zara's nightmares grew more intense. Malcolm installed more security cameras throughout the house, determined to capture whatever force was disturbing them. But each night, when he reviewed the footage, the result was the same: shadowy figures and glimpses of movement that always seemed just out of reach, as if the entity knew it was being watched. One afternoon, in a rare moment of calm, Malcolm decided to confront Harold Baker. Harold knew something. Malcolm was sure of it. And if he had to force the truth out of him, he would. He waited until he saw Harold outside, tending to his meticulously trimmed hedges, and then strode over, trying to keep his anger in check. Harold barely looked up, a smug expression curling his lips as Malcolm approached. "Harold," Malcolm began, his voice steely, "we need to talk. You seem to know more about our house and what's happening than you've let on." Harold chuckled, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Malcolm with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "Oh, really? And what exactly would you like me to tell you, Mr. Harris?" "Enough games," Malcolm snapped. "You warned us when we moved in. You said that outsiders aren't welcome here. What did you mean by that? What's going on in that house?" Harold straightened, his expression darkening. "That house was never meant for you. The Thompsons built it with their own hands, and Mr. Thompson, he was one of us. This street doesn't take kindly to strangers, especially ones who ignore its history." "What history?" Malcolm demanded, his voice rising. "You talk like the house itself has some kind of agenda, like it has a mind of its own." Harold smirked. "In a way, it does. Old houses, old spirits. They remember, you know. They remember who belongs and who doesn't." Malcolm felt a surge of anger, but something else as well. Fear. Harold's words carried an ominous weight, and for the first time, Malcolm wondered if there was truth to the idea that the house itself held on to memories, onto grudges. "And Thompson," Malcolm pressed, ignoring the unease in his gut. "Is he the one Zora's been seeing? The one scaring my daughter?" Harold tilted his head, his gaze piercing. "Maybe. Or maybe it's the house itself showing her its displeasure. Either way, you should take the hint, Mr. Harris. Hollowbrook Street doesn't want you here." Malcolm clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. "I don't care what you or the house thinks, Harold. We're not leaving. I'll do whatever it takes to protect my family. Whatever it takes." Harold's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Be careful what you promise, Mr. Harris. This place, it has a way of testing your resolve." When Malcolm returned home, he was tense, his mind racing with thoughts of Harold's warning and the veiled threat lurking beneath his words. He didn't tell Rachel about the conversation, not wanting to add to her anxiety. But deep down, Malcolm felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a fear that no amount of preparation or protection could shake. That night, the atmosphere in the house was heavy, as though the walls themselves were closing in. After tucking Zara into bed, Malcolm and Rachel sat together in the living room, neither speaking, each lost in their own thoughts. They had tried every conventional approach: therapists, cameras, extra security, but nothing seemed to make a difference. If anything, the disturbances were growing stronger, more personal. Around midnight, as Malcolm sat staring into the darkness, he noticed Zora's door open slowly. He bolted up, his heart pounding, and rushed to her room, expecting to find her awake, frightened. But when he entered, Zora was fast asleep, her breathing steady. He scanned the room, his gaze falling on the shadowy corner near her closet, the spot where she'd first claimed to see the man. Then he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Leave." The word sent a chill down Malcolm's spine, and he backed out of the room, closing the door behind him. He staggered down the hallway, gripping the wall to steady himself. But as he reached the living room, he found Rachel standing there, her face ashen, her eyes wide with horror. "Malcolm," she whispered. "I heard it too." The voice. It was right outside our bedroom. They stood in silence, the weight of their fear binding them together as they realized that this was no longer just about Zora's room. Whatever was haunting them had spread, its influence seeping into every corner of their home. The next day, Malcolm felt an unshakable need to uncover more about Mr. Thompson and the history of Hollowbrook Street. Determined to find answers, he returned to the library, this time looking for anything about the neighborhood itself, not just their house. And buried among the dusty records, he found a worn leather-bound journal labeled Property and Community Records. Hollowbrook Street, 1955 to 1985. As he flipped through the journal, Malcolm's heart skipped a beat when he stumbled upon a section devoted to community events and incidents. It mentioned several past residents who had reported similar disturbances, shadowy figures, unsettling whispers, and doors that opened and closed by themselves. The entries spanned decades, each one recounting a family's experience of moving into the neighborhood and ultimately leaving under mysterious circumstances. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note, scrawled in a hurried hand. "Those who leave are safe. Those who stay, beware. Malcolm closed the journal, his pulse racing. His mind returned to Harold's words, the smug satisfaction on his face as he'd spoken of the history of the house. It was no coincidence. Hollowbrook Street didn't want outsiders, and anyone who dared defy that unspoken rule paid the price. That evening, Malcolm shared what he'd found with Rachel. They sat in the kitchen, the air around them thick with tension, as Malcolm showed her the entries in the journal. Rachel's hands trembled as she read the warnings, her face pale and expression grim. "So it's not just us," she murmured, looking up at Malcolm. "This, whatever it is, it's been here all along." Malcolm nodded, his jaw set with determination. "We need to do something, Rachel. We need to confront this, whatever it takes. I'm not going to let some spirit, or whatever this is, drive us away." Rachel took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with tears. "Malcolm, I'm scared. What if we make things worse? What if we end up like those other families?" Malcolm reached across the table, taking her hands in his. "We won't. I'm not going to let that happen. We're stronger than this, whatever this is, and if it wants a fight, then it's going to get one." They spent the rest of the evening preparing, researching ways to confront and cleanse a haunted house. They gathered candles, sage, salt, whatever tools they could find that might ward off a spirit or dispel the dark energy. As night fell, they moved through the house, lighting candles in each room and drawing protective symbols on the doors and windows. Zara watched them with wide eyes, clinging to her stuffed rabbit. She didn't ask questions, sensing the gravity of the situation, but she stayed close, as though instinctively drawn to her parents' side. When they reached Zora's room, Malcolm took a deep breath and began to speak aloud, his voice steady and resolute. "We're not leaving," he said, his words clear and defiant. "This is our home now, and whatever is here, whatever thinks it can scare us, will have to face us." For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Then, without warning, a gust of wind swept through, extinguishing the candles. Zara gasped, clinging to Rachel's leg, and Malcolm felt his heart skip a beat as the room plunged into darkness. And then, in the silence, a voice filled the air, deep and full of malice. "You should have listened." The words echoed through the room, chilling them to the core. Malcolm stood his ground, his hands trembling, but his resolve unbroken. "No, we're staying. This is our home now." The voice laughed, a cold, mocking sound that seemed to seep into the walls, filling every corner of the room. As the laughter faded, the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, and the room returned to an eerie calm. But Malcolm knew that this was only the beginning. Whatever presence they were up against had no intention of letting them stay in peace. They had made their stand, but now they would have to face the consequences. And deep down, Malcolm feared that the true horror of Hollowbrook Street had yet to reveal itself. The haunting unleashed. The confrontation had only strengthened Malcolm's resolve, but it also intensified the disturbances in the Harris home. That night, after their defiant stand, sleep was an elusive luxury. Every creak and shadow seemed amplified, each sound more threatening than the last. Rachel lay wide-eyed beside him, her hand clutching his as they lay in silence, each breath filled with tension and unspoken fear. The eerie laugh that had filled Zara's room echoed in their minds, chilling them to the bone. When dawn finally broke, Malcolm barely felt the relief of daylight. He sat at the edge of the bed, mentally cataloging their options. Harold had made it clear that they weren't welcome, and Zara's nightmares hadn't lessened. Malcolm knew that something more drastic would need to be done if they were to regain peace. That morning, after dropping Zara at a friend's house for a playdate, Malcolm and Rachel reached out to a local paranormal investigator. Desperation had overruled their skepticism. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. The investigator, an elderly woman named Elise with a gentle demeanor and piercing, perceptive eyes, agreed to come over that afternoon. When Elise arrived, She brought with her a variety of tools: a small black case containing a tape recorder, a bundle of sage, and a crystal pendulum that glinted in the dim light of the Harris living room. She examined the house carefully, her movements deliberate and practiced, as if she had done this 1,000 times. Malcolm watched her with a mixture of curiosity and hope, while Rachel stood nearby, clutching her arms in nervous anticipation. "Tell me about what's been happening," Elise said, her voice calm and steady. Malcolm explained everything. The shadowy figure Zora had seen, the whispers, the mocking laughter, the word scrawled on the wall. As he spoke, Elise nodded, her gaze thoughtful. When he finished, she placed a reassuring hand on Rachel's shoulder. "These occurrences aren't uncommon in homes with unresolved histories," she said. "Sometimes spirits linger, trapped in a cycle of anger or pain. But what you're describing sounds like something more than a simple haunting. There's a strong energy here, a deeply rooted hostility." Rachel looked away, her voice barely a whisper. "Why? Why us? What did we do to deserve this?" Elise sighed, her expression sympathetic. "It's not about what you did. Sometimes, it's just about the energy of the place. Places like this can trap emotions, memories. And if the previous occupant, Mr. Thompson, carried heavy grief or resentment, that energy may have left an imprint here." She paused, glancing at Malcolm. "I'll do what I can to help you. But I must warn you, this may not be easy. If this presence is as powerful as it seems, it may resist any attempt to dispel it." Elise set up her equipment in Zora's room, placing the recorder on her nightstand and holding the crystal pendulum above her bed. Zora, who had returned from her playdate and was watching from the doorway, looked up at her father, her small hand clutching his tightly. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling, "is the lady going to make him go away?" Malcolm knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. "Yes, sweetie. She's here to help us. We're all going to make him go away." Elise glanced back at them, offering a reassuring smile before she began. She closed her eyes, murmuring under her breath, her fingers gripping the pendulum as it began to sway. Zora watched with wide, unblinking eyes as Elise moved through the room, her voice soft but firm, as if addressing an invisible guest. "Whoever you are, you no longer belong here. You are not welcome in this place," Elise said, her tone commanding. "Your time here is over. You must move on." For a moment, the room felt tense, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Then suddenly, the air grew colder, a chill so sharp that it left a sheen of frost on the windows. Malcolm and Rachel exchanged frightened glances, clutching each other as Zora buried her face in her father's shirt. Elise continued undeterred, her voice growing louder. "Release this home. Let go of the past, and leave these people in peace." The pendulum in her hand jerked violently, swinging wildly as though it were being tugged by an unseen force. Elise's face grew pale, her grip tightening as she tried to steady the pendulum. Then, in an instant, it stopped, hanging still and lifeless in her hand. Elise opened her eyes, her expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before she turned to Malcolm and Rachel. I think it's gone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, glancing at Rachel with a faint smile. Relief washed over them, and they finally dared to believe that the nightmare was over. That night, for the first time in weeks, Zora slept peacefully. Malcolm and Rachel sat up late into the night, talking in hushed tones, their spirits lifted. They dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, their ordeal was behind them. But in the early hours of the morning, a sharp, shrill scream shattered the silence. Malcolm and Rachel bolted upright, their hearts racing as they scrambled out of bed and ran to Zora's room. When they burst through the door, they found her standing in the center of the room, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "He's back," she cried, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. "He said he's never going to leave." Malcolm felt a surge of dread, his heart sinking as he looked around the room. The air was thick with a suffocating cold, and an oppressive presence lingered, filling every corner with a sense of malevolent energy. Rachel took Zara into her arms, rocking her gently as she whispered soothing words. But as she tried to comfort her daughter, Malcolm noticed something scrawled on the wall above Zara's bed. A new message, written in dark, jagged letters. I need you. The words seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, each letter sharp and vicious. Malcolm felt a wave of anger surge through him. He'd tried to stand up to this presence to defend his family. But now, it was clear that whatever force they were facing had no intention of letting them go. The next morning, Malcolm called Elise, desperation coloring his voice as he described the night's events. She listened patiently, but when she spoke, her tone was somber. Malcolm, she began, her voice heavy with regret, I don't think I can help you anymore. This entity, it's something beyond my experience. It's feeding off the fear in your family, growing stronger. I'm afraid you may have no other choice but to leave. Malcolm clenched his jaw, a mixture of frustration and defeat washing over him. But where would we go? We've uprooted our lives to move here. We can't just leave. Isn't there anything else we can do? Elise hesitated, then sighed. There is one last option. I know someone, an old friend, who specializes in cases like this. He's unconventional, but if anyone can help, it's him. His methods aren't always easy, and they may come with a cost. But he's your best chance. Malcolm glanced at Rachel, who nodded with a mixture of hope and fear. We'll do whatever it takes, he replied firmly. Just give us his contact information. That afternoon, Malcolm contacted the man Elise had recommended, Father Matthew, a retired priest who had devoted his life to studying and confronting the paranormal. When Malcolm explained their situation, Father Matthew agreed to come immediately, sensing the urgency in Malcolm's voice. Father Matthew arrived that evening, a weathered man with silver hair and eyes that held a quiet strength. He carried a leather-bound Bible and a small vial of holy water, his presence bringing a strange sense of calm to the house. He walked through each room, pausing in Zara's to examine the scrawled messages on the wall. He murmured prayers under his breath, his expression darkening as he took in the evidence of the entity's malice. This is no ordinary spirit, he said finally, his voice filled with gravity. This is something ancient, something that has tied itself to this place. It may be connected to Mr. Thompson, but it goes much deeper than him. The spirit here thrives on fear and hostility, and it's using those emotions to grow stronger. Malcolm exchanged a glance with Rachel, both feeling the weight of Father Matthew's words. They had tried everything, and now this final attempt felt like their last hope. Father Matthew set about preparing a ritual, lighting candles in each corner of the house and sprinkling holy water on the walls. He instructed Malcolm and Rachel to hold hands, forming a protective circle around Zara as he began chanting in Latin, his voice a steady, powerful rhythm that seemed to fill the house with a strange warmth. As the ritual continued, an eerie wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles one by one. A deep, guttural laugh echoed through the house, sending chills down their spines. But Father Matthew's voice didn't waver. He stood his ground, continuing his chant with unyielding determination. The laughter grew louder, more menacing, and the air grew thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to push against them, as if the house itself were trying to force them out. Then, with one final chant, Father Matthew raised his voice, calling out in a thunderous tone, "By the power of the divine, I command you to leave this place. You have no power here. Release this family and depart." For a moment, the house seemed to shudder, the very walls vibrating as if in response to his command. And then, just as suddenly, the air grew still, the oppressive energy lifting as a faint echoing wail faded into silence. Father Matthew lowered his arms, his face pale and drenched with sweat. He looked at Malcolm, a faint smile breaking through his exhaustion. "It's over," he whispered. "The spirit has been expelled." Malcolm felt an overwhelming surge of relief, his eyes filling with tears as he hugged Rachel and Zara tightly. They had fought for their home, for their family, and they had won. But even as they celebrated, a shadow lingered in the back of Malcolm's mind. The house felt calm now, almost peaceful, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Hollowbrook Street held more secrets than they could ever truly understand. The final revelation. In the weeks that followed Father Matthew's ritual, life on Hollowbrook Street returned to an uneasy semblance of normal. The oppressive atmosphere that had once filled the house had lifted, and Zara's nightmares ceased. Malcolm and Rachel dared to hope that the haunting was truly behind them. They focused on rebuilding their lives, making a fresh start they had once dreamed of for Zara. But lingering questions gnawed at Malcolm. Father Matthew's words echoed in his mind. This spirit is something ancient, something tied to this place. The entity had been powerful, persistent, and filled with a wrath that was far from random. Even with the house peaceful once more, Malcolm found himself questioning why it had chosen their family, and why it had seemed so determined to drive them away. One evening, while Rachel and Zara were at a friend's house for dinner, Malcolm decided to visit Harold Baker. The old neighbor had been there for decades, witnessing the comings and goings of families on Hollowbrook Street. Harold's warnings, his thinly veiled threats, and his insistence that outsiders weren't welcome in the neighborhood hinted that he knew more than he'd let on. Now that the haunting had ceased, Malcolm hoped that Harold might finally tell him the truth. Harold answered the door with a bemused expression, his face twisting into a slight sneer as he saw Malcolm standing on his front porch. "Back again, are we, Mr. Harris?" Harold's voice was as grating as ever, but this time, Malcolm refused to let it deter him. "Yes, I am," Malcolm said, his voice calm but firm. "I need answers, Harold. You've made it clear you know more than you're letting on. I think it's time you told me the truth about this street, this neighborhood, and this house." Harold let out a low chuckle, crossing his arms as he leaned against the doorframe. "The truth. You came looking for the truth only after it almost destroyed you." Malcolm felt a surge of frustration, but forced himself to remain calm. "My family has been through enough. We deserve to know why we were targeted." Harold regarded Malcolm for a long moment, his gaze hard and unyielding. But finally he sighed, stepping aside to let Malcolm into the dimly lit living room. As Malcolm entered, he felt a chill settle over him. The house was cluttered with old furniture, thick with the scent of dust and stale air, and heavy with an atmosphere of neglect. "Sit," Harold commanded, motioning to an armchair across from him. "You want the truth. Fine, but you won't like it." Malcolm sat, his pulse quickening as he prepared himself for whatever secrets Harold was about to reveal. Harold leaned back, crossing his legs as he began to speak, his voice low and measured. "This street, Hollowbrook Street, isn't like other places. It was built on land that, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly clean. There's history here, and not the kind you'll find in any record." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "What kind of history?" "Old history, dark history," Harold replied, his gaze distant, as if he were recalling something buried deep in his memory. Back in the late 1800s, long before this neighborhood was here, this area was a site for strange gatherings. Rituals, people called them, but they were far from innocent. A group of locals believed they could commune with spirits, that they could summon something ancient, something that held knowledge or power. But they didn't just summon spirits. Harold paused, his face darkening. They called something into this place, something that's been here ever since. The founders of this neighborhood thought they could control it, harness it to protect their own. So they built Hollowbrook Street on this land and marked it with boundaries. They kept outsiders away, believing it would keep the entity bound, but that wasn't enough. Malcolm felt a chill creep up his spine. "You're saying this entity, this thing, protects the neighborhood?" "In a way," Harold said with a shrug. "It was supposed to." but it only protects those it recognizes as belonging. The Thompsons were the last family it accepted. But when old Mr. Thompson died, the bond began to weaken. The spirit grew restless, and every family that's tried to settle here since has been removed. Some left willingly, others were driven out by force. Malcolm clenched his fists, anger boiling beneath the surface. So you knew this would happen. You knew my family would be targeted, and you did nothing. Harold's lips curled into a twisted smile. Why should I have warned you? People like you don't belong here. You're outsiders, and the entity sees you as a threat. It doesn't want you here any more than I do. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay composed. This entity, Father Matthew said it was tied to resentment and anger. Is that why it's so hostile? Because of people like you who filled it with hatred? Harold laughed bitterly. Maybe, but that doesn't change the reality. You and your family are intruders, and it's only a matter of time before it comes back, stronger than before. That little ritual your priest friend did, temporary at best, it won't hold. The words hit Malcolm like a punch to the gut. He had thought they were safe, that Father Matthew had expelled the entity for good. But now, faced with the grim truth, Malcolm realized that this was only the beginning. Malcolm returned home that night, his mind racing as he replayed Harold's words over and over. The ritual was only temporary. The entity would return, and it would be angrier than ever. He sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, as Rachel came in, her expression filled with concern. Malcolm, what's wrong? He looked up at her, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and fear. I spoke to Harold. He told me that, whatever Father Matthew did, it's not enough. This spirit, this entity, it's bound to this place. It's not gone, Rachel. It's coming back. Rachel's face paled, and she sank into the chair beside him, her voice a hushed whisper. Then what do? We can't keep living like this, Malcolm. We can't put Zara through this again. Malcolm took a deep breath, his hand gripping hers tightly. I know. I've been thinking, and I believe there's only one way to stop this. We have to confront it. Not just defend ourselves, but truly face it. Find the core of its anger, and somehow put it to rest. Rachel stared at him, her eyes wide with fear. You're talking about provoking it. Malcolm, that's dangerous. We don't know what we're dealing with. I know, he said, his voice filled with a grim determination. But I'm not going to let this thing drive us away. We came here for a better life, and I'm not leaving until I know it's safe for Zara. They spent the rest of the night preparing, gathering every protective tool and symbol they could find. They filled the house with candles, set up mirrors to reflect negative energy, and sprinkled salt around Zora's room. But the true test would come in confronting the spirit itself, uncovering its motives, and trying to release it from its cycle of anger and pain. That night, they put Zara to bed, her room lined with salt, and her favorite stuffed animal surrounding her. Malcolm and Rachel sat beside her, telling her stories and holding her hands as they waited for the familiar chill to settle in. And sure enough, around midnight, the temperature dropped, a cold so intense it seeped through their bones. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, gathering and thickening until they formed a faint, ghostly figure at the foot of Zora's bed. Malcolm took a deep breath, stepping forward as he addressed the spirit, his voice steady and unafraid. Who are you? Why are you tormenting my family? The figure shifted, the outline of a face emerging from the shadows. An old man, worn and twisted with years of resentment. It was Mr. Thompson, or what was left of him, his ghostly form flickering as he spoke in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. They didn't let me rest. The figure rasped, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and anger. They'd made me stay here, bound to this house. All I wanted was peace, but they trapped me, used me to guard their precious street. Malcolm's heart ached with a strange sympathy. You don't have to stay here, Mr. Thompson. You don't have to keep hurting people. Let go. Find peace. The figure wavered, his expression flickering between rage and sorrow. For a moment, Malcolm thought he had reached him. But then, the entity's face twisted with fury. "Peace," it spat. "They cursed me with anger and hate. And now, that's all I am. Anger, hate. I'll never find peace. And neither will you." The room shook, the walls trembling as the entity unleashed its fury, lashing out in a violent burst of energy. The candles flickered and went out, and a gust of icy wind swept through the room, shattering the mirrors and scattering the salt. But Malcolm didn't back down. He stepped forward, meeting the entity's gaze, his voice filled with a fierce determination. "Then let your anger end here. Let it end with us. We won't leave. We won't be driven out. This is our home now." The entity hesitated, its form flickering as though struggling to maintain itself. For a long, tense moment, the room was filled with silence. And then, slowly, the figure began to dissolve, its edges blurring as it faded into the darkness. As the last remnants of the spirit disappeared, the room returned to its normal temperature, the oppressive weight lifting as peace settled over the house. Malcolm and Rachel stood there, holding each other tightly, relief washing over them as they realized that it was finally over. The entity's curse had ended. They had stood their ground, and they had won. In the days that followed, the house felt different, lighter, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. Malcolm and Rachel watched Zora sleep peacefully each night, her nightmares a distant memory. Hollowbrook Street had accepted them, the entity's anger finally put to rest. And though Malcolm knew they would never forget the horrors they had faced, he felt a sense of triumph, a hard-won peace that had cost them dearly, but had ultimately given them the home they had fought so hard to protect.